we are going to start looking at principles of classification, which is page 248 in your textbook. And essentially the purpose of today is to understand why we classify animals, how we classify animals, and sort of what taxonomy is. So you can appreciate what taxonomy is, you first of all have to have a sort of a bit of an understanding about biodiversity. So you will have heard this term before. Biodiversity is a measure of the variety of living organisms and their genetic differences. So it's all the different organisms that we have living around the world. And as you guys are sure you are aware, our biodiversity, or Earth's biodiversity, is reducing rapidly because of different sort of environmental concerns, global warming, loss of habitat, things like that. Biodiversity, or a large biodiversity, is a result of millions of years of evolution, and that means there are a great number of names for the same organism. So if you can imagine internationally, in English a flower might be called a rose, but in Arabic it could have a completely different name, in Spanish it would have a completely different name, in French it would have a completely different name. So we have to have an internationally recognised way of referring to any living organism, so that if scientists from different countries are discussing an animal, they can know that they are discussing the exact same thing and nothing is lost in translation. Having a classification system, an internationally recognised one, also allows scientists, environmental scientists, to monitor population changes, and it also makes ancestral relationships clear. So it makes it clear to scientists what animals are related to what through their sort of genetic family line. So we typically group organisms based on similarities and differences. So, organisms have things in common, would be grouped together, and we would use their differences to help exclude them from a particular group. So this sort of classification comes under the title of taxonomy, which is the science of describing, classifying and naming living organisms. So that's what taxonomy is. Now, there's been a couple of different ways that we've grouped organisms over the years. Originally, organisms were grouped based on morphology, so what they looked like, and this was using analogous features. So these are features that look similar or have a similar function but are not from the same biological origin. So, for example, they might have grouped all flying animals as one particular group. So, bats, birds, insects with wings would have all been put in together, and whilst their wings look the same and whilst they have similar functions, they're not all actually from the same biological origin. They don't all share a similar sort of singular ancestor. So in the 18th century, Linnaeus developed the first scientifically devised classification system based on homologous structures. So that is, structures that are actually from the same biological origin. Okay, so homologous, however you choose to say it, same biological origin. Analogous, they look similar or have similar function but are not the same biological origin. So we've moved away from this early classification. This was sort of, the ancient Greeks. Aristotle, for example, used this sort of system, and in the 18th century, Linnaeus moved us on. So we now use the binomial system, and this is a system that was originally devised by Linnaeus, and we've just kind of updated it and added to it as we advanced sort of in technology, and we could determine differences between animals to a finer detail. Binomial means two names in Latin. So using this system, every organism is given two Latin names. So you have the genus name or the genus name, and then the species or specific name, which identifies that specific organism. So for example, Homo sapiens would be human. So this Homo would be the genus, and sapiens is the species or specific name. Now, I've written that in a way that I'm hoping is clear for you on the video to see, but actually there are particular rules for when we're writing binomial names. So we should use italics. Your genus should have an uppercase letter, and the species should actually have a lowercase letter. So we should have a capital H and a lowercase s. And then after the first use, in writing, for example, scientific report or scientific journal, once you've used it fully the first time, after that you just abbreviate your genus to the first letter. So the first time I wrote this, I would write it as Homo sapiens, capital H, lowercase s in italics, and then every subsequent mention I would just put H, capital H dot sapiens. So that's how you should write it. In an exam situation, I would obviously not stress too much about using italics. It wouldn't be expected that you change your handwriting into some sort of italic font, but do use the upper and lowercase rules and this third rule about abbreviating the genus name after your first usage. Okay. Now, when we fully classify, animals, we classify them according to this. So this would be their full sort of classification. So we'll talk about what these mean in a second. But you have a domain, a kingdom, a phylum, or a division if you're talking about a plant. So phylum would be for an animal, division would be a plant, a class, order, family, and then you have this genus and this species, and it's these two that become our binomial names. You do need to know the order of these. The textbook suggests I think it's a mnemonic. Desperate King Philip came over for good spaghetti, but obviously you can make one yourself, or if you can remember without doing that, that's absolutely fine. But that would be the order of the classifications. Okay, so remember your genus and your species are what make up our binomial names. Now, if we have a look, we can go through into what these actually mean in slightly more detail. The definitions in the book are quite wishy-washy because you don't really need to know anything too specific in this. So I've taken the definitions from the book, so if you've got difficulty sort of understanding what I'm saying or reading my writing, then they are straight there. But your domain is essentially the three largest classification categories, and funnily enough, there are three of them: your archaea, bacteria, and eukaryota. So in a domain, you have to have one of those three as your answer. Okay, and then we move down to the kingdom, and that's just the next classification category down. And you have the archaea bacteria, and they match up with the archaea domain, and it's the only one that does. So if your domain is archaea, your kingdom has to be archaea bacteria, and these, if you think of the word archaic, kind of ancient, and bacteria, these are your ancient bacteria. Okay, we then have our eubacteria, and again, eubacteria only matches with the bacteria domain. So if your domain is bacteria, your kingdom has to be the eubacteria, and this would be what we consider true bacteria. So when we've been talking about bacterial growth in previous lectures and sort of bacterial diseases, they would all come under this eubacteria kingdom. And then lastly, the eukaryota domain has four kingdoms: Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. So Protista is your microscopic organisms, stuff like amoeba. Fungi is just a fungi. Okay, remember they have chitin, not cellulose, in their cell walls. So that could be a way of you sort of differentiating what kingdom they need to go into. Plantae, autotrophs, making their own food by photosynthesis. So funnily enough, majority of your plants are going to be in there. And then animalia are your heterotrophs, i.e. they consume others that move their whole body around during at least one stage of their life cycle. So in an exam, they might give you the domain and ask you to select the correct kingdom. The ones you can do most easily are obviously your archaea and your bacteria, because they only have one kingdom each. For your eukaryota, you need to think a bit more about what organism you're actually looking at and which kingdom it best fits into. Okay, we then come down to a phylum. Remember, phylum is for your animals and division would be for a plant, and that's just a group of classes that all share the same characteristics. You'll start to notice that the definition of these are very similar to when we talk about levels of organisation in tissues and cells. You'll see that they are all related to each other. So a class is a group of organisms that all share the same common characteristics. Order, a group of families that all share common characteristics. A family is a group of genera that all share common characteristics. Genus is a group of species that all share characteristics. And then shockingly, species is a group of closely related organisms that are all capable of interbreeding to produce fertile offspring. This is what's really important for a species, okay? They can interbreed. So to be from the same species, you have to be able to breed. The organisms have to breed with each other and produce fertile offspring. So this is why tigers are a species and lions are a completely different species, because when they breed, it might be successful, but the offspring they are produce are not going to be fertile. So this is your really important definition. We're going to look at sort of how we define species and different models for species in a later lecture, but the fact that they can interbreed to produce fertile offspring is really the defining characteristic of a species. So that's it for taxonomy and classification. What's really, or sort of most important really, is that you know what the full classification and the different sort of divisions are. As I said to you, you're probably not ever going to be asked to give a full classification of an organism, because that's quite difficult. They might give you the information and then ask you to order it correctly. So they might tell you the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus and species for all of for an organism, and then ask you to put it in the right order. Or they might give you all of this information and then ask you to use it to work out the organism's binomial name. So obviously you would just pick the genus and the species and write it correctly. As I said to you, they might give you a domain and ask you what the kingdom might be, because you could work that out if you know what the organism is. But essentially understanding what classification is, why we do it, and knowing these different subdivisions and how to write a name in sort of binomial expression is really your main takeaway around this. And understanding that we're grouped according to similarities and differences in their phenotype. Okay, now you've finished your notes. If you've got any questions, pop them on the discussion board on Schoology and get started with your next tasks.